Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Drake Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, author David Daniel, and ASL interpreter Shelley. We are excited to have David as our November author. David has written more than a dozen books, including White Rabbit, a novel set in San Francisco in the summer of love, and four entries in the prize-winning Alex Rasmussian, I never think I'm going to pronounce that right, Alex Rasmussian Lowell-based mystery series. His story collections include Coffin Dust, 6 off 66, and most recently, Inflections and Innuendos. A new collection, The Apparatus of the Dark, will be published later this year. He teaches at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. David, when should we expect The Apparatus of the Dark to be on our shelves?
Uh, well, it should be relatively soon. It's going to start off as an ebook, and then it will become an actual print book. But I thought it was going to be October, but it's been delayed a little bit. But
Well, that happens.
it'll happen when it happens.
Now, tell me about that printing process. You start as an ebook and you become a real book. What is that?
Nowadays, and I won't go into it much because I don't understand a lot of it myself, but
Oh, good.
with the sort of democratization of books, which has been a long, slow process over, centuries, really. Way back when books were something that only people of means could afford. And over time, they found ways. Paperback book was a great move forward. So nowadays, I think there's often books will come out in a number of different formats. And in this particular case, I think they decide that they're going to go with an ebook first, because a lot of people just read off of their devices, and then it'll follow up with a quality paperback, soft cover format.
Oh,
This
okay.
I don't think will ever be a hardback, and that's fine with me.
So you're going to share some of your lovely writings with us today?
Yes, I'm just trying to get a little more volume here. Can you hear me okay?
We
Yes.
hear you perfectly
Okay.
fine.
And I've got you up. Yeah, so I'll just make a quick comment, Diane. First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you to Drake Arts for this. Tom, good to see you again. Shelley, thank you for taking part in this. Alex Rasmussen, the name of that private eye that you struggled to pronounce, you're not
Sorry.
alone in that. When I was looking about for a name for the private eye, I wanted it to be somebody, a name that was not common in Lowell. So it kind of ruled out Irish surnames, Italian names, French Canadian names, et cetera, et cetera. And I went through a list, I made up a list, and then I looked in the Greater Lowell phone book to make sure there wasn't a single character with this name.
Oh, wow.
And because I wanted to emphasize the fact that this character is kind of a lone operator, the classic private eye, and is in a sense neither fish nor fowl. I have him being from Lowell, having formerly served the Lowell Police Department, but I didn't want it to be such a common name that people were thinking, well, maybe it's loosely based on so-and-so. And there've been times in the years since when people have struggled over that pronunciation, where I've thought maybe I ought to have made a different choice, but
He reminds me of Rasputin. That's what I want to say every time.
Yeah, well, it is. It's Alex Rasmussen or Rasmussen, however people want to say it. So, but anyway, so since this is going to be a reading and maybe some discussion and some Q&A, and I welcome people to ask any questions, I'll begin with a very short piece and then maybe use that to talk about other things. I think I'm going to really stick with my very short stuff today, only because it's difficult without a text in front of us to really sometimes follow the spoken word. And I think, although there are some lovely long stories that I would love to share, I think I'm going to stick with pretty short things, but that's subject to change with notice as we go along. This first one is going to be called, it is called Aristotelian Nights. Eddie Hayward was one of my boys in high school. Big E, we called him, an amiable goofball. He was tall and soft-bodied with curly brown hair. He was the only guy I knew for whom condoms were more than just wallet stuffing. He'd had the same girlfriend since junior high. Along with the steady girlfriend and condoms, he had wheels, a big 10-year-old boat of an Oldsmobile. It was long and maroon, and best part, it was a ragtop. Hey, he told me one day, if you ever want to borrow it. I didn't abuse the privilege. For one thing, I wasn't an experienced driver, and I worried that I might bang it up. Sometimes, though, I did take Eddie up on his offer. I'd go to his house, give him $1 and get the keys, then cruise over to pick up whomever I was dating at the time. By the way, if $1 sounds cheap, note that gas was 30 cents a gallon. Summer nights were the best. The car had a mellow burble from the dual exhausts, which made up for the fact that the radio didn't work. I wasn't a very good conversationalist, so what I used to do in order to have something to say was read up on a topic, Shakespeare maybe, or the great philosophers. Anything from way back in time was good. I didn't know squat, of course. I'd skim an entry in the Funk and Wagnall's encyclopedia set my folks had got, one volume at a time at Stop and Shop. I'd pick up some names and a rough timeline. My date and I would be cruising along by the bay, the night wind soft, top down, you'd feel the flow, air cool and secret in the low spots, salt scented with the sea. And I'd let out the words, what little I knew, mashed together with everything I didn't know. I'm very interested in the Aristotelian concept, I'd say. You know about that? No? Well, let me tell you what the philosopher said, etc. I don't know why Aristotelian. Socratic was beyond me, all questions and answers. And maybe Platonic made it seem off target somehow, like I was only interested in being friends. Mainly, I liked the way the word rolled off the tongue, Aristotelian. If I'd known then of Epicurus, party time, he'd probably have been my go-to guy. I was a bit of a budding Buddhist too, which is to say, I knew one ancient scripture, the one about life being like the reflection of a moon on water. Which one is the true moon? Did any of this work? Who knows? It's not like now. Now everyone's got a handheld Library of Alexandria and can check the facts. You say that Aristotle was Plato's teacher? You sure about that? Neptune has how many rings? Don't you mean Saturn? And so on. I miss those long gone days of 30-cent gas and the soft Aristotelian nights with Ellen or Lorraine or Leslie in Big E's convertible, the soft wind spanking halyards on the moored sailboats in the bay, fluttering my girl's hair, moonlight on the water. So that is Aristotelian nights. And I find myself more and more looking backwards and back to a time of youth, back to a time of being alive in the world. And in a way, I'm reminded of the comment that Nick Carraway makes in The Great Gatsby when he's having a conversation with Jay Gatsby, and Gatsby says to him that he wants to recreate the past. And Nick says something to the effect that you can't remake the past. And Gatsby looks astonished at that idea. And he just says, of course you can. Well, it's an interesting question because I think we would all say the past is immutable in some sense. And yet, I recently was reading a very, very good book by Lisa Genova, who's a neuroscientist, called Remember. And it really deals with the idea of memory And it makes some interesting points. And one of them is that, and I think it's something we've all always known, and that is that what we think we remember of the past is not really what happened. And that it's our creation of a past based on what struck us at the time, what was important, what had some emotional impact. As far as the specifics of what happened, there's no accuracy in that. And so in a sense, I find by going back to these early days, even though I'm using some, quote, real life people altered in ways, some real life memories, these are really largely fictions. And so in a sense, a story becomes a little bit of a time machine that can kind of carry us back, and gives us an opportunity in a way to recreate a past, and in some ways improve upon the past. In my stories of the past, if it's a first person story and if I'm the narrator, and that's a mistake I think sometimes we make when we're reading, if it's a first person, we sometimes assume that is the narrated story. Even if that's so, it's largely a made up. So I think of my work as drawn in many ways from real life circumstances, and yet I would put it down to about maybe 5 to 10, 15% max is what I think was really going on. And the rest of it, which is really the vast bulk of it, is pure fiction. And sometimes when I've had students talk about being worried about writing a particular story because they were sure people were going to recognize themselves in the story, I often would just say, don't even worry about it. They're probably not going to recognize it. But if you change the names, if they've got memories of that past, their memory is going to be very, very different from yours. And as long as you say, this is a work of fiction, any resemblance to real life and real people is purely coincidental, you're good, you're covered, that's fiction. So anyway, I'll share another story that, well, I'll let you decide. And this one's called Cold Cream. Lying here, watching my wife prepare for bed, I find myself remembering childhood nights when I would visit cousins in the city for a sleepover. 12 years old. My Aunt Gloria would wash her hair and wrap it up in a towel, and then sit on the sofa in a terry cloth bathrobe and put cold cream on her face. Pond's made the cold cream. It came in a jar of thick, milky glass, and my aunt would slip her fingers into its smooth whiteness and trowel it onto her cheeks, her forehead, smoothing it over her brow, along the wings of her nose, under her chin. It made her face shine, which always made me think of an angel somehow. When the towel came off, she would wipe her face and then sit before her mirror and brush her hair, 100 strokes. Come on, my cousins would call to me, let's play hide and seek. There were lots of places to hide in their third floor apartment, closets, a pantry, a back hallway. I remember crouching in darkness, listening to the clank and hiss of steam radiators, the whoosh of subway trains passing outside, different from the sounds of my suburban world. She was a lovely woman, my aunt, a serene presence. She had beautiful skin and hair, warm blue eyes, and a fresh, open disposition. I was secretly infatuated with her. My wife stands before her vanity mirror and smooths something definitely not Pond's cold cream onto her face. It's an expensive emollient, whisper light with only the faintest intoxicating scent of wild raspberry. Aunt Gloria's husband, my uncle, I suppose, though I never came to think of him that way, had gone off to war and never come back. That was a mystery for years, talked about in hushed tones by adult relatives. But eventually, it was revealed that he was not killed or captured in the war. He was one of the missing from domestic action husbands. The war was one thing, The responsibilities of the family were another. I'm sometimes sad thinking of my aunt and her solitary years. Not that they weren't full years. She had her son and daughter, my cousins, and a busy career. She worked in a medical office, one of the most prestigious cardiology practices in Boston. Doctors who had treated presidents, ambassadors, and kings. Aunt Gloria dated some of the doctors, men who had all kinds of knowledge about the workings of the heart, but apparently very little about its deeper forces. Nothing ever came full circle. All those nights, all the cold cream, all that womanly beauty that called to my young heart and remained self-contained. What for, if only to be alone, with no one there in the quiet dark to savor the softness? These are mysteries I couldn't fathom then, and still can't. I turned to the woman there with me, running my hands, my cheek against her smooth skin, breathing the faint scent of raspberries. I had read that story to a group once, and afterwards, a gentleman from the audience came up and identified himself as a physician. He'd been actually, I think, a cardiologist in Canada. And then late in his career, he kind of turned away from that, studied Freudian psychology, and became a psychoanalyst. And he said to me, "You know what that story's about, don't you?" And I just said, "I had a crush on my aunt." Simple as that. So I didn't go in the deep Freudian deep dive, but if it's there and people see it, then it's there. So there are certain things that are important to a writer when we begin a story. And there are a couple of decisions that need to get made kind of right up front. One of them is our point of view. And that's usually limited to three options. We're going to go first person or third person, the most two common ones. And occasionally, very occasionally, one might opt for a second person story. And so that decision is made. Am I going to go first person, in which the narrator is telling the story, or am I going to go third person, in which an unseen narrator is telling the story through the point of view of one of the characters or more in the story? Once that's decided, then there's got to be a decision made about what I think of as kind of focal length. How close to the story, how close to the materials do you want to have the camera? How close in do you want your reader to come to the workings of the mind of your character? And then I think the third decision, these aren't the only decisions, obviously, but these are some basic craft decisions that have to be made, is verb tense. Am I going to tell it as a past tense story, which, as we think of it, is generally the way we tell stories, because we're often telling something that has already happened. And so past tense is kind of a natural choice, but present tense is also a choice. And so once you've decided those, is it going to be a first or a third, or rarely, but occasionally an option of second? Is it going to be close in? Are we going to work close to the actors in the story? Or is the camera going to be drawn back and we're going to reveal things in a different way? And then are we going to tell it as if it has happened, or if it's presently happening? And I think once those decisions are kind of squared away, then you sit about and create the story. And some writers love to know exactly as they begin what's going to happen step by step. Is it going to be a story where I know how it ends before I get to the end? Or other writers sometimes like to look at story as a sort of means of discovery. I have some idea of how I want to get there, but I'm not sure what's going to happen in the meantime. And I frankly am not entirely sure how the thing's going to end. but I'm confident that as I work through the story, I'll find it and I'll discover it. And I think it was Joyce Carol Oates who said sometimes it's like you're setting out on the one side of a river and you're going to swim across and you kind of draw a bead on something on the opposite bank. But because there's a current, you set out toward that and you get swept along sometimes, and you do get across, but you find yourself, you've wound up in a very different place than you thought you were going to when you set out. And I kind of like that. Doctorow used the metaphor of driving a car at night, and your headlights illuminate a certain portion of the road ahead, but you don't know what's beyond that point of illumination. And so the drive is a sense of discovery. And so I think those are kind of useful metaphors for thinking about the way a story sometimes works. And then I think as the story goes along, other elements of the craft, the plot, the building of the characters, etc., fill themselves in as we go. Here's a little story, very short little tale. And I'm going to guess that most everybody has seen the movie Summer of 42, which is a movie from, okay, I see you shaking your head, Diane. I'll have to give a little account of it, and you might want to watch it. It was one of the most popular movies, actually, in the 1970s. And I believe that the soundtrack song, the title song, was one of the most popular songs. It's basically a story of coming of age, of a young man who with his family goes out to, I think it's Fire Island, each summer back in the 1940s. And now he's an adolescent teenager. And in this one particular summer, the summer of 1942, he's there with friends who are also summer residents each year. And there's also a young woman who is there, and she is a war bride. And she's very much in love with her husband, and he goes off to the war. The young man gets to be kind of friendly with her, and from a distance develops quite a crush on her because she's a lovely woman. And the story follows an interesting arc, and it is kind of a heartbreaking ending to it. So without saying anything more and giving away, this is a story which is cast, I guess you'd say, in the form of a letter, and the title suggests that. It's called Dear Jennifer O'Neill. And I might add that the young actress, I think it was her first role, that played the young bride in it, was a lovely young actress and model named Jennifer O'Neill. So this is called Dear Jennifer O'Neill. When I watched Summer of 42, I could have been Hermie. That's the young man. I could have been Hermie. So smitten was I by the brokenness of your beauty. But he was just a squeaky-voiced coming-of-age kid. I was already a man. It wasn't 1942. It was 1971. I knew of war and love and their costs. You and I were the same age, born under the same sign. What happened? Didn't you get my letters? Why wouldn't you take my calls? I know, how naive to think that I could surmount the ramparts of movie stardom that ringed your tanned and lovely radiance. But damn it, I tried, rain and shine, and I clung to a hope that fervor and soulful words would convince someone to put my messages through. But no, all gone like valentines carved into an apple tree in a neglected orchard. Forgive me, I'm not angry. I'm not. I'm trying to understand. You married 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. Now, scores of summers have passed. Numberless wars have been waged. Ignorant armies have clashed by night. The seas have risen. Shorelines have disappeared. In time, the ever-moving tide sweeps away all that lies before it. But really, 9 times, 9 freaking times, when we could have pledged our troth ever to be true, you and I could be as wondrous as lovers in the desirous pop-torn dark of a movie palace, holding hands in the balcony and watching a movie of young love amid the dunes with seagulls soaring through the luminous violin air. That's dear Jennifer O'Neill. And if you haven't figured it out, she was married 9 times. And that always baffled me. How could somebody get married that many times and still keep doing it? It was either this fervent belief that there was the right person out there and I was going to find them, or I don't know. But anyway, so that was my love letter to Jennifer O'Neill. Anybody have any questions about anything at this point or any point?
I've noticed in the stories you've shared so far, they're very straightforward, but at the same time, they're very poetic, almost like you're writing poetry, but not exactly. And in the past, I read other stuff where the author's trying really hard to construct nice phrases, and it just comes across as kind of artificial. And I notice in the stories you just read, they're very poetic, but they don't seem contrived or artificial. It's just you talking. I don't know if you worked really hard to achieve that, or can you comment about that at all?
No, that's a great question, Tom. And I think the answer is, yeah, some of those lines, those great lines, only took me about 10 hours to come up with. And I think when you're telling stories that are kind of drawn from ordinary materials, one of the things that you've got that you can offer the reader that gives that familiar story a little freshness or something that's a little bit different is what Robert Frost referred to as a performance in words. So that you've got to, and I think it's probably akin to a good musician who gets to riff on a particular song, whether playing a saxophone or an oboe or a guitar or whatever it might be, and you get to give it something that maybe takes it beyond the familiar, and maybe goes beyond the notes on the page. And so those are things that, yeah, I work to try to put those in. And the danger is, of course, that they become obvious and feel out of place. And as you suggested, maybe somebody trying a little bit too hard. And so that's always the thing I try to steer away from it. And yet I want those to be there because I want there to be a quality that maybe elevates the story. And I think in some of that language, it gets to what the themes of the story. And I'm not a writer that begins with themes and sets out to try to write to a theme. I like to write the story, feel some connection to the characters, and then hopefully, if I do it right and do it well and use the craft to do that story, then themes will emerge spontaneously on their own. And so that's kind of what that's about. And I think a lot of it has to do with looking around for entry into the story, something that makes it a little bit different. And a frequently asked question of writers is, where do you get your ideas? And Stephen King used to like to reply when somebody said, where do you get your ideas? Because he was asked it so often. He took to saying Cleveland, as if there's a place where ideas come from. But the truth of the matter is that ideas are really everywhere. And once you've trained yourself to start looking for them, I think this is true, and you people who are musicians could answer it better than I. But my guess is some of those very prolific songwriters, I think of, Lennon and McCartney, or Duke Ellington, Stevie Wonder. Yes, they work hard at their craft, but they find themselves looking for ideas. And as a result of that, they find them. If you train your eye to look for things that might make a good story, by God, they're there. They're all over the place. And we all experience the same world out there. We experience it our own way, but we often see all the same things. I sometimes like to watch stand-up comedians. And one guy whose work I really like, who's actually a local guy, I think he's from Cambridge originally, Stephen Wright, who's got this very minimalist, dry style. But I sometimes think he looks around the world, the same world that I see, that you see, and he sees things or picks up on things that I might see, but I just pass over. Like, for example, you often hear somebody say that I'm afraid of heights. People talk about having a fear of heights. Well, Stephen Wright's got a little bit, he says, some people are afraid of heights, not me. I'm afraid of widths. And so he sees the little thing and gives it a little quarter turn and comes up with a quick little joke like that. And so in writing stories, it's much the same. You're looking at the world that's an ordinary world. What can I find in it that might make a story? And how can I make it a little bit fresh so that it might interest a reader? Here's one that I think will speak for itself. When I was talking earlier about those early choices of where do I go? Do I go with a first person or go with a third person? Another decision that has to be made is if you're telling the story with a particular character in mind. And most short stories, not necessarily sort of novels, but most short stories are going to have a main character, a protagonist, a particular point of view that we can identify as the agent of action and reaction in a story. And one of the decisions that one makes is it going to be a female perspective or is it going to be a male perspective? The go-to is obviously, we tend to go with our own gender. Man's going to write male stories, female's going to write female stories. And it extends to other decisions that one might make. As a white male, is my point of view always going to be that? Maybe what Toni Morrison talks about as being the sort of white gaze. That's a natural. But what if I want to tell a story from the perspective of somebody who is a person of color? Or what if I want to tell a story about a person who's very old? I've been young in my life, and now I'm experiencing what it's like to be old in life. So I can own writing about youth and childhood. And I also find myself writing about getting old and being much older. But you've got to make some decisions about how am I going to do that? And how am I going to be able to do it so that it feels authentic, that it feels true to experience. And so sometimes I'll experiment around with point of view. And this is the story that I think will make a little more sense of what I'm saying here. This one's called Tinker Toys. And you'll see that it uses a present tense perspective. Lucy is in Boston for a 3-day conference on commercial architecture. She grew up in Weybridge on the city's South Shore. And although she has not been back in over 20 years and no longer has family in the area, she nevertheless finds herself experiencing an unexpected sense of return. On the final day of the conference, she takes advantage of a break in the schedule to view a scale model futuristic city made from Lego blocks by local school children. It sets her thinking about her own childhood experiments with construction toys. While her older brother and his friends were into erector sets and her sister played with Lincoln logs, Lucy favored Tinker Toys, those spindly wooden sticks with the little perforated hubs into which you inserted them. They seemed more graceful, fuller of imaginative potential than the erector set in Lincoln logs. The one seemed rigid and mechanical, the other limited. Okay, you've got a nifty cabin, but where do you go from there? With Tinker Toys, the design possibilities spoke off in all directions. Lucy would assemble something, bask briefly in her parents' praise, then take the thing apart, slide the pieces back into their tall cylindrical box, and next time fashion something entirely different. On her 9th birthday, Lucy began a design that she did not dismantle right away. For days, she labored at it. Her dad brought home more boxes of Tinker Toys. Over a course of summer months, what she was making grew in complexity and beauty and size. Her brother and sister, indifferent at first, cheered her on. Her mom, beaming with approval, said that the structure was taking over Lucy's bedroom. Maybe Lucy could move it out into the backyard, where it continued to expand. No limits for Lucy, no limits for Lucy, became a family chant. The contrivance stretched to the property lines, grew so tall that Lucy worked standing on step ladders. Soon, the town insisted she apply for a building permit, which her dad did. Lucy kept at it. By then, the fabrication was already topping the tallest trees in the neighborhood. Someone remarked that planes flying out of Logan could see it from the air. A joke, no doubt, but the point was made. A local TV station ran a feel-good feature on the 6 o'clock news. Someone from the Army Corps of Engineers praised the project as showing refreshing initiative. The town planning board discussed passing an ordinance against structures over 100 feet tall. But Lucy, 12 years old by then, had nothing more to prove. She had created what her imagination had shown her was possible. And there it stood, a thing of rickety backyard wonder, monumental, majestic, grand. In junior high school, she became engrossed in the accounts of gone civilizations and the relics they left behind. Great Cambodian temples and Aztec stone ziggurats in the brooding jungles fascinated her. By senior year, she had been accepted at UCal Berkeley. There, majoring in architecture, she met her future husband, and upon graduation, they moved to Seattle, had 2 children, and Lucy nursed the dream of building something worthy of history. Of course, life often demands that we scale down dreams, and if certain of hers now seemed out of reach, still, she could take some muted pride in her designs of supermarkets and shopping malls. Such are Lucy's thoughts in Boston upon seeing what school kids have done with Lego blocks. Later, as her Seattle-bound flight leaves Logan, she peers from the plane's window, scanning the still familiar landscape. She identifies the smokestacks of the old soap factory, the derricks of the shipyard, and picks out the small curve of beach in her hometown. And astonishing, there, overgrown with trees, its slender spokes laced with thick vines that have evidently kept it upright and intact these many odd years, is her masterpiece. All but invisible, you wouldn't even think to look if you didn't know it was there. The trees moving in the wind seem to be aflame with green fire. As she gazes down, Lucy's eyes mist with tears, for the only thing on fire these days, she thinks, is time blazing away all around her. Yet there is her Tinker Toy structure, the child of her own childhood imagination, like a lost temple in the jungle. The airplane floats on. So that's Tinker Toys. which I'm guessing everybody remembers. They still have them?
Oh
I
my God,
don't know.
I
They
love
do?
Tinker Toys. I know they had them 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're wonderful. I never
And
liked
Lincoln
them.
Logs, you remember the Lincoln
I
Logs?
remember that.
Yeah, I didn't like Lincoln Logs either for the same reason. You didn't
Good for
like them.
good for log cabins, like you said in the story, not a lot else.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, the you can put Tinker Toys together at any angle, right? Lincoln Logs have to be square.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah. Um, and then of course there was Mr. Potato Head, which was a different kind of functional toy.
Mm.
But this story is one that illustrates something that I've kind of found and been enjoying doing a lot of in recent years. And it's what I sometimes call magical surrealism,
Mm.
different from, I guess, magical realism. And it's stories that will begin in kind of a bedrock of everyday believability
Mm.
and then start sometimes very suddenly, quick cut, or slowly, and move into something that becomes decidedly surreal. And I think this is one of those.
You mean her structure isn't still there?
It could be.
I believed it could be. So not quite surreal, but maybe just on the very edge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Tinker Toys would not last that long in the woods. But yeah, I mean but still the image is there, the clarity with which you described it,
Yeah,
it's there.
yeah, right. And I kind of leave Lucy at the end of that story to kind of her own thoughts, because in some ways she feels that she's failed in a way, even though she's very successful. She's got a family and kids and a career and has won awards for her designs, but it somehow hasn't realized that dream of childhood. And I think that's an element of stories as well that I'm finding in sort of jumping in the Wayback Machine and going back to stuff from early days, real and or imagined. And that's something one reckons with. And I think a happy person, happiness and contentment grows. James Taylor's got that song called Secret of Life. And the secret of life is not new to him. I think it's ancient wisdom, is being content and happy with what is. And so I think Lucy's going to be doing a little bit of thinking as she flies back to Seattle, trying to figure out that, wait a sec, I've got everything to be grateful for. So, but anyway, so that's how I mean earlier that theme can creep into stories. I wasn't intending any of that, but I think a reader might find that there.
I found it particularly interesting that she found this thing she liked and she really pursued it. And people around her, family, her town, could have poo-pooed it and said, oh, well, that's good enough, stop there. You shouldn't really do that sort of thing. But she didn't stop, and her family supported her in doing this thing, even though it was humorous. And then as her town tried to limit her, she didn't accept their limits. So to me, that part of the story was an inner journey that was just really terrific. And far too much in our culture, people are limited to not do things, to not strive to do things. So to me, even though her later career didn't reach such heights, that she was able to have confidence in herself and build this cool thing that was fun, not didn't profoundly affect lots of people, but it changed her a lot.
Yeah, and exactly right. And I think, and I know you people are musicians, and I talk to so many people. And it's not an uncommon question that people ask each other: do you play a musical instrument? We all get asked that from time to time. And it's also not uncommon for many people, maybe the majority of people, to say, I took lessons when I was in fourth grade, or I studied piano, or I studied the violin or the saxophone or whatever. But the bulk of people, for whatever reason, abandon it. They don't have the patience for the practice, they don't have a feel for it, or whatever. There's 1,000 reasons. But some people stay with it. And then later in life, and I often envy those people. I'd love to be able to play an instrument. I'd love to be able to speak 5 languages. But you know, there's that sense of finding something that speaks to us and seeing it through and staying with it. And I think that's probably somehow the way it happened with me with writing stories. Is I cannot remember a time. Oh, I can probably remember a time, but I have to go way back to find a time when I wasn't fooling around writing stories. And in the early days, they were always stories of writers. I was imitating Edgar Allan Poe. I was imitating this writer, that writer. And I think that's an important phase in it as well. Is you've got to do that. You've got to kind of learn the craft. And part of that is done by reading, and part of it's done by lots of experimentation and lots of failure. And that failure continues. You know, you write a lot of stories. I read a lot of stories. I've written probably in the last handful of years, maybe 300 stories. But they're not all good stories.
Well,
You hope that some of them are. And it doesn't matter. You don't care. It's not like a sweepstakes. So
yeah, no. I mean, it's interesting that you said we all try something. Actually, Tom's not a musician, but it's really important to try and be exposed to a lot of things like um, watercolor painting and
yeah,
crayoning and drawing with ink or with charcoal or writing in different forms, you know, trying the different poetry forms, trying the different writing forms like an essay or a chapter or a novel. I mean, these are all they're different skills and they require different types of thinking, playing with math, playing with science.
right.
And I say playing because you really, if you're going to get into things, it's not just learning the facts, it's learning what comes around the aha. And everything has an aha moment, right?
Yeah,
And that's the essence of creativity. That's what makes us human, is that aha moment. And it's not just the artists who have those aha moments, the scientists have them too. And to recognize that and accept it, and not everyone will have not just the capacity, but also the love and the will to do everything. We can't possibly do everything. So actually, one of our artists coming up, she's a quilter now, but she started out as a photographer, and she started out also as a screen designer, graphic artist, screen designer. So we're going back in time, but you know, those skills, they build on each other, and it's so important. Not only do they build on each other for us as an individual, but I can appreciate and understand and enjoy a writer's work and respect it because I know how difficult it is. I can't do it. I'm not good at it. And I can enjoy and appreciate how the scientists come up with things because I have an inkling of an understanding of what's behind all those years of study to get
yeah,
where they are. And that's so vitally important. Being able to be an audience, being able to be appreciative of the other things that each of us bring to our society is really, really fundamental.
yeah.
Well, I think we forget that.
I think that's exactly right. And it's not something that's necessarily time limited either, in that the things that we're going to get really good at are probably things that, all things considered, it's better to start something early. If you're going to play golf or be a basketball player or anything, you start early and put in the time, you're probably going to develop a facility for it that somebody that maybe picks it up years later may not. But I think the idea of, as you say, trying different things. In that book, remember that Lisa Genova's talking about doing that is one of the best ways to continue to make neural connections
Well, yeah, there's
and
that.
encourage that plasticity in our brain and to ward off the slow decline. And so I think that's a great thing to do, to try many things. And it's great for kids too, the kids to try everything. try every sport, try travel, do all of these things, because eventually you find the things that really speak to you. And those are the ones that you then may be willing to devote your time to perfecting.
Well, right, but not only perfecting to be able to do it, but also perfecting to be able to go and appreciate someone else who's done such a fabulous
Yes, exactly.
job, right? I
Yeah.
mean, because we live
Yeah.
in community with each other, we live in a society, and to be
Mhm.
able to appreciate that's Drake Arts is all about appreciating all the different arts.
Right.
We need artists as well as audience, or we have nothing.
I know, I
You
know.
know, you don't write your books to have them up on a shelf. You write them for people to digest,
Yeah.
you know, and it's
Mhm.
important.
Yeah.
And we've been digesting a lot of your work now. It's been really wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe we have time for one short one.
I would love to do that. I was just thinking the same thing, David.
Okay. I think I'll sort of change gears and read an earlier story. This is from my book, Coffin Dust, which has just come out in a new edition. And this was a story from many years ago, but it's a story that, back to the point of deciding on the angle of approach that we're going to use on a story. This one does something that I don't generally do. Usually in a story, you're not going to head hop around character to character. That's something that maybe can be done in a novel more easily, but in a story, you generally stick with one point of view. But this one does make a little character shift in the middle from one character to the other. And it's called The 3 o'clock. The 3 o'clock. At precisely 4 p.m., the door marked consulting room opened, and a man wearing a white coat peered out into the patient's reception area. Morris Grant, who was the only person sitting there waiting, took that as a signal, set aside the magazine he had been thumbing, and rose uncertainly. "Dr. Shaw?" he asked. The doctor smoothed down the front of his white coat and waved Morris in. The consulting room was dimly lighted by a floor lamp, furnished with an oriental carpet and 2 large upholstered chairs. Thank God, Morris thought, there was no couch. He waited to see where the doctor sat and then took the other chair. The doctor looked at a daybook calendar on his desk. "First visit, is it, Mr. Grant?" "Yes, first time to a psychiatrist, too." Yes, well." The doctor seemed almost as nervous as Morris was. He looked again at the daybook, then pushed it aside. "Maybe we should begin with some history," he said. Morris was game. He was here and it was costing him. Might as well play the whole game. "Sure. Your name, please?" "You've got it right there. Please answer the question." "Morris R. Grant, R for Richard, age 42, since you'll probably ask that next." They went through some other details. Married, yes, kids, a boy and a girl, both teens. The doctor asking questions, but offering no comment. "Now, Mr. Grant," said the doctor, "can you tell me why you're here briefly?" "I'm depressed, or so my regular doctor says." "You don't know if you are?" "I don't know if that's the right diagnosis. I feel depressed." "About what?" "If I knew that, I probably wouldn't be here." "Is there anything going on in your life to make you depressed?" "My wife." "Your wife?" "My kids." "Your family, in other words. If you knew them, you'd be depressed too." "Anything else?" "That's mostly it." "What about your family depresses you, Mr. Grant?" "What about any family? I've been married 20 years. I come home from work. The kids barely say hello unless they want something. My wife's on me to do this, do that. I can't please her." "Please her?" It was a shrink trick, Morris recognized, repeating your last words to keep you going. He'd seen it on TV. For what this guy charged, he certainly wasn't doing any heavy lifting. "Lately, it's about painting the house or repointing the bricks on the front steps, and always about making more money. That's a biggie with us." "Money?" "College tuition bills coming, retirement, stuff." "I see." I mean, after all this time, why can't she just accept who I am? I'm not a guy who's going to suddenly start making $1 million. And when I'm off work, I don't feel like scraping the paint off the house and doing it all over again. The paint job's still got life in it. And while I've still got some left in me, I'd like to enjoy my free time doing what I want. You tell her that? Tell your family? In so many words. What is it you like doing in your free time? Reading crime novels. Crime novels. Yeah, you know, murder mysteries. Why do you enjoy that kind of book so much? Morris thought about that one because it was the first halfway interesting question the guy had asked. What he came up with for an answer, though, wasn't much. He shrugged. Escape. From what? He saw the layout now. $80 he was paying to play 20 questions. And white coat aside, Dr. Shaw didn't impress him much. He didn't even look the part. No little pointy beard and horn-rimmed glasses. He was suntanned with a big hard face and hands that would have looked more fitting on a bricklayer. Maybe he'd come to Morris's front steps. Mr. Grant? Okay, escape from what I was telling you about. The job, the house, my life, pressures. Just a little release so when I come back, I'm not a bear. It's doing something that makes me feel good. Is that wrong? You tell me, is it? Morris should have known. Don't ask a question here. No, he sighed. I don't think so. And yet the world we live in, it says, yeah. Somehow, if a person isn't always being productive, making money some way, jacking up the other guy, getting ahead, then it's wrong. Unless he's on vacation, but what's that, a couple weeks a year? Rest of the time, he's busting his hump to keep other people happy. And if he thinks too much about his own happiness, well, that's bad. He, said the doctor. All right, me. But you don't think it's bad? Not really, no. Then why are you depressed? Morris thought about that also. Okay, maybe I buy into the game too much and it bothers me that I do. I mean, maybe I should be doing something more constructive in my free time than just sitting in the backyard with a can of beer reading. Should you? Some people do. Should you? Maybe. Well, no. You sure? I mean, I'm not hurting anyone. I'm mostly a good husband and father. I work hard at my job and bring home a steady check. We'll get the kids through college, okay? I mind my own business, keep the grass mowed, and try to be neighborly. My dog likes me. Hey, I even return the shopping cart to the little corral in the supermarket parking lot. What's wrong with any of that? Well, all right, nothing. There's nothing wrong with it. Then why are you here? The doctor spread his hands, the strong-looking fingers splayed in a gesture that suggested Morris was free to go. Wait, aren't you going to come up with a label? Label? Like clinically depressed, bipolar, whatever? A flicker of something, was it anger? Passed across the doctor's face. Do you believe you're one of those things, Mr. Grant? Morris thought about it. Was he crazy? Is that what the guy was asking? Morris was a little down, sure, and tired. Hell, midlife crisis maybe, but not something with a long, serious-sounding medical name. Do you think being told you were would help you? I'd probably get pissed off. Or if I said you don't love your kids, your wife, hey, watch it. The doctor nodded. I don't think that's necessary. You seem in pretty good shape to me. You know who you are, what you like, and what you want. You read about murder, but you don't think about committing it. You're sensitive enough to know you're sometimes confused. Welcome to the human race, Mr. Grant. Things will work out. Go. But the time isn't up yet. That's all right. Yeah, but for $80, forget that. The doctor spread his big hands again. This one was free. Seriously? There are people a lot worse than you, believe me, a lot worse. Morris left, smiling. There was a small break there. When Morris R. Grant was gone, the man in the doctor's chair stood up and yanked off the white coat. Beneath, on his shirt, bloodstains were still damp. He tossed the coat into a corner and went through a door to a private inner office. A man lay on the floor in a sticky pool of blood that had run out of a huge gash in the side of his head and trickled down into his gray beard. His wire-rimmed glasses lay bent and broken beside him. He was dead. Stupid goddamn shrink, the big man thought, coming at me with all those friggin' labels. Paranoid schizophrenia with violent sociopathic tendencies. How is that going to help me? How is that going to help the women all over the city who've been living in terror of a serial strangler for the past year? Labels. That Grant guy was right. It made you angry. Angry enough to grab a heavy stapler and swing it. The big man clenched his hands, felt them tremble. But now he had to get out of here, like he should have before Grant ever showed up. But there hadn't been time. And there it was on Shaw's daybook, a 4 o'clock, right after his own 3 o'clock appointment. Morris Grant, first session. The daybook also showed that there was one more patient scheduled for the day, a regular, because the name was there in the book every Friday at 5 p.m., going back several months. She'd be here any minute, and she'd know in an instant that he wasn't Dr. Shaw. Time to split. He glanced again at the daybook, his own name at the 3 o'clock spot. He tore out the page and glanced again at it, his own name and Morris Grant's, and the name of the patient who came every week, a woman who probably had problems of her own, maybe lonely, with no family or close friends. He closed the door, moving as in a trance, and went back into the consulting room. He recovered the white coat from where he had thrown it, almost 5 o'clock. Miss Irene Fallon was due in any minute, might already be out there in the waiting room. He cleared his throat. Hello, I'm Morris Grant, he rehearsed. Dr. Morris Grant. He felt his big hands begin to twitch. I'm filling in for Dr. Shaw, who's very ill. Pulling on the white coat, buttoning it to hide the bloodstains, he stepped toward the waiting room door.
Whoa.
That's
Gosh.
the 3 o'clock.
David.
Yeah, double twist there. Whoa.
So anyway,
Oh my gosh. How to leave us. I can't believe you're leaving us with that story.
sorry.
Gosh.
I could have chosen different, I'm sorry, but anyway.
No, that was really
What?
interesting.
Oh my gosh.
It is what it is.
That was great. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
and now we have to thank our donors too. Oh goodness. Marianne Dornice Goldman, Lois Welber, Blue Shutter Web Design, Anonymous, Diane's Song, the Massachusetts Cultural Council as administered by the Billerica, Chelmsford, Draycott, and Tewksbury Cultural Councils, and the Cultural Investment Portfolio Grants. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm very excited about this event. It's just been fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I haven't tried. If you'd like to be a donor, please contact us at draycottarts@gmail.com or visit us at draycottarts.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, Shelley, Diane. Appreciate it.
Oh gosh.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.